Silver is a confounding, confusing, and controversial metal whose continued use in American federal circulating coinage from 1794 to 1970 was the central focus of competing visions for our economic system, a galvanizing topic for 19th century American populists, and a metal whose role in American life was as confounding as it was sometimes maddening. In this podcast, economist William Silber joins us to talk about silver and how the white metal shaped America and the modern world. Before we get into that, the CoinWeek podcast is brought to you by PCGS. Now, through June 30th, PCGS is running a silver certificate special in honor of important milestones for two famous American silver dollar coins. Submit 5 silver certificates for grading by PCGS banknote and pay for only 4. That's a free cert, authentication, and grading for 1 note when you submit 5. Visit www.pcgs.com to learn more. And hurry, time is running out.
Charles and I are very lucky today to be joined by Dr. William Silber, a senior advisor with Cornerstone Research and the former Marcus Nadler Professor of Economics and Finance at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's also the author of the 2019 book, The Story of Silver, How the White Metal Shaped America and the Modern World, which will be the focus of our interview. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
You write in your From the Author section that, and I quote, "History surprised me with events and personalities that changed my thoughts and perceptions." Could you share an example of a story or figure that changed your perceptions of the white metal?
Sure, but before I do that, I think it would be better if I tell you why I wrote the book, what I wasn't surprised at, and then what surprised me.
Okay, fair enough.
So this really was triggered in 2014. When this project was triggered in 2014 when Bunker Hunt died. And I told my kids, who were then in their 40s and who had been working in finance all their lives, I said, Bunker Hunt died. And they looked at me and said, hey, Dad, isn't that the guy who keeps on hitting it in the sand in your Sunday golf game? Well, I said, obviously, Bunker Hunt does not resonate with them. They just think about bunkers in golf. So I said, well, if that's the case, I've got to write a book about Bunker Hunt, who in fact supposedly perpetrated the greatest commodities market manipulation in the 20th century by manipulating the price of silver during the 1970s. And when I started to look at that, I found that in 1980, the price of silver hit $50 an ounce, which is still the record price. It's still the highest price for an ounce of silver ever. And when you look at that history, you see that the price of gold was $800, the price of silver was $50, and the ratio of those two is 16 to 1. And what I quickly recognized was that 16 to 1 had an illustrious history in the United States. So I started to look into the history. You want me to keep going, or do you want to interject with a question?
No, keep going. I mean, many collectors are well familiar with these ratios. Of course, we're completely untethered from them now.
That's correct. So most people were just amazed that we finally got to a ratio of 16 to 1 of the price of gold to silver. Now, I knew from my economic history that 16 to 1 was the way the United States started its monetary system. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, when he was the first Treasury Secretary, established gold and silver as equivalent to a dollar, except it took 16 ounces of silver and only 1 ounce of gold to get a dollar coin. And this was, in fact, something called bimetallism. Bimetallism is the dollar was defined in terms of two metals, gold and silver, in a ratio of 16 to 1. And this continued for the first 70 years or 80 years of the US, where gold and silver were equivalent in a dollar, except in the ratio of 16 ounces of silver and 1 ounce of gold. And that happened until 1873. And most of coin collectors probably know there was something that happened in 1873. It was the crime of 1873. The crime of the 1873 was the United States stopped minting silver dollars.
Well, just to interject for a moment, my understanding is, and this could have been a misspeak on your part. So my understanding was that the 16 to 1 ratio certainly existed, but when they created the monetary system in the United States, the dollar, the $1 coin, was a silver coin that was more or less related to the basically the European coinage at the time, and that the gold, so the dollar would have been roughly an ounce of silver being $1, and that the gold was 16 times more valuable. So they had gold coins in the value of $2.50, which would have been about the size of a U.S. dime. $5 and $10, and the $10 coin was the eagle, which was about half an ounce of gold. So it wasn't exactly one
Well,
ounce of gold was a dollar.
no. Everything that you just said is correct. And all I was saying was that the price of of silver was $1.29, and the price of gold was close to $20. Okay, and the ratio of those two was 16 to 1. There was the eagle coin, which was a $10 coin. There was the double eagle, which was a $20 coin, and so forth. So the ratios were, you had different coins, but the ratio of the two prices, $20 for an ounce of gold and $1.29 for an ounce of silver, was 16 to 1.
Yeah. I just want to
Is
make
that
sure I was clear on that.
good? No. I'm glad make sure that I was clear on it too. Both of us were clear. So as soon as I started to think about, as soon as I got to 16 to 1, not only was it 1980, but it was 1792 in the beginning of when the United States coinage, 1873 when when they stopped coining silver dollars, and that led to a huge decline in the price of silver, because the U.S. Treasury was no longer buying silver at $1.29, and the price of silver collapsed, and that led to probably the most important speech in American electoral politics, and that was William Jennings Bryan in 1896, the Cross of Gold speech, which was all about silver. He wanted to resume the price of silver, and he ran for president of the United States. This was the first time. He ran 3 times, and he lost all those times. And the United States remained on a gold standard because silver was no longer considered, was no longer accepted at the Treasury, where the Treasury would pay $1.29. So historically, in the United States, 1792, 1873, 1896, and 1980 are all sort of well known as dealing with the ratio of the price of gold and silver. And in 1980, that ratio was resumed from all the way back in 1792. So those things were not a surprise to me. Alexander Hamilton wasn't a surprise. William Jennings Bryan wasn't a surprise. But there were a couple of people who were very important in silver who were a big surprise to me. Do you want to know who they were?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I was stunned when I found out that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the greatest American presidents, who took us out of the Great Depression, was intimately connected with manipulating the price of silver. And it wasn't because he was so much interested in silver, he was interested in passing the New Deal. And in order to get the New Deal passed, which was kind of a very, was a revolutionary concept, in order to get the New Deal passed, he needed the help of senators in the U.S. Senate, and there were 14 senators that constituted something called the Silver Bloc in the U.S. Senate. And they were from states like Idaho, Nevada, Utah, and so on, that were silver mining states. And in 1932, silver hit the lowest level it had ever hit. It hit 24 cents. And miners were very upset, silver miners from the silver mining states, Nevada, and so on and so forth. And there was a deal cut between the Silver Bloc senators, led by a fellow by the name of Key Pittman. Key Pittman was a senator from Nevada. And he said, listen, Mr. President, if you want us to vote for the New Deal, we want you to pass a Silver Support Act. And in 1934, FDR, in fact, supported something called the Silver Purchase Act, which which didn't say we're going to restore $1.29. After all, it was only 24 cents. To restore $1.29 would have been really tough. But he said, we're going to make silver equal to 1/4 of our national monetary reserves. The Treasury is going to keep on buying silver until it's 1/4 of our national reserves. That drove up the price of silver from 24 cents to over 70 cents, which was a big deal. The miners loved it. But that caused one of the America's biggest important allies in the Far East, China. It created a problem for China. When China could least afford it, it was Chiang Kai-shek, who was the nationalist, against Mao Zedong, who was the communist leader. And what happened was Roosevelt's support for silver and the rising price of silver forced China off the silver standard. China was on the silver standard, and that allowed Japan to take advantage of China. And the Japanese, in fact, invaded China in 1937. So the US, FDR, drove up the price of silver to get the New Deal passed, but in fact promoted a weakened China, which Japan was able to take big advantage of, and almost was the beginning of World War II. So FDR manipulated the price of silver, didn't care that it weakened China, and in fact opened the door for Japan to dominate China. So that was a big surprise to me. A big surprise.
Let's talk about FDR for a minute. Obviously, I think anybody in numismatics is well aware of Executive Order 6103. So this is when, in 1933, it's a culmination of a series of executive orders where the Roosevelt administration essentially gets the United States off of the practical gold standard. We more or less stay on it for the debt obligations for foreign debt, but American citizens and banks and institutions are asked to turn in their gold holdings. So this is where Fort Knox gets constructed. The gold coins go away. So this seems like a cleaving, if you will, between the relationship between gold and silver coinage. We stay with silver as a coinage metal, and it backs paper money until 1964. The Coinage Act in 1964 gets us off of silver altogether, and now silver and gold as coinage metals stick around really as a collectible, sort of a throwback to a different time. But in all practical purposes, this was the end of metals, precious metals being used in coin money. What happens with the relationship between gold and silver during the New Deal after this 1933 moment? Does silver take this opportunity to sort of become a hegemonic monetary metal and gold goes away, or does it still stay as a secondary citizen in this international scheme where you have gold and silver as the two coinage metals?
Well, that's a great question, and in fact, we know that circulating gold coins stopped in 1934, or 1934. The January of 1934 was when they called in all the. Well, actually, it was in 33, but in the beginning of 34, they called in all the gold coins, but silver coins, in fact, continued to circulate and became the only backing. Gold was still at $35 set at $35 an ounce, but you could not exchange gold for coinage. You could not use gold for coinage. Internationally, gold remained at $35 an ounce. So foreign central banks could exchange gold dollars for $35 per gold for an ounce of gold, but U.S. citizens could not. Silver, on the other hand, remained a metal that was coined in the United States.
So let's return to the colonial period, to the beginning of the story you just told. You mentioned Alexander Hamilton, and that our bimetallic system was a product of, came out of the 1790s, and that Hamilton was sort of the mastermind behind the initial currency system, which changed over the course of time. What was it about the way money circulated in the colonies that concerned Hamilton about the evils of scanty circulation, and what convinced him that a bimetallic system, with silver and gold being the two monetary metals, what convinced him that that was the right system?
Well, I'd like to say it was because Hamilton was a genius, which many people say that he was, but he was an Anglophile. And he loved Britain. There were people who accused him of wanting to make George Washington a king, and I'm not going to go there because I don't know anything about it. But the entire world before 1800 were essentially on a bimetallic system. England, what's the currency of England called? The pound. Ready? Sterling. What's sterling? Sterling is silver. So although we think of Great Britain as being the main example of the gold standard, that didn't happen until at least 1816, 1819, 1821, 1844. There were a whole series of changes in Great Britain. But before 1800, the entire world was on what was basically a bimetallic standard because gold was too scarce. And because gold was so scarce, they needed another metal that could be used to transact. So it's Hamilton really was simply transferring the system that was in Europe, mainly in England, to the United States. And in a sense, bimetallism, where two currencies serve as backing, it's like there's, I hate to use the word optionality, but it allows the monetary system to switch between two metallic backings when one becomes very scarce. Because when one becomes very scarce, it tends to reduce economic activity. So as soon as gold becomes very scarce and the price level starts to drop, well, then silver can come in, and vice versa. And this movement, this optionality between those two metal backings was something that Hamilton wanted to preserve. And he was right to do it.
It seems to me at the same time as the framers, I guess, of our monetary system are thinking this through, that this would more or less be a radical departure from what they're used to, because during the colonial period, Britain was operating on this mercantilist economic system, so the colonies existed simply to send their treasure to the island. And this is it's also informed, I guess, Britain's relationship with India, another colony. One of the things that strikes me is when we look at the coinage in that period of time, there are copper coinages that were issued, much of the copper coming from Birmingham, England, but they really didn't have much success circulating their own silver coins in the colonial area, and most of the silver that was circulating was probably coming from the Spanish colonies. So when Hamilton was devising this idea, first and foremost, I guess, on their minds was how to keep the silver and gold coinage in America in the first place. That was no guaranteed bet.
No, there absolutely wasn't. And in fact, one of the big problems of a bimetallic system, which you touch on, is that you must get the ratios of those two metals right. Otherwise, there was something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is Gresham's law. Gresham's law meant that if you overvalued some coin, then the one that was undervalued would circulate, and the overvalued one would be kept in the cupboard in the form of whatever was being displayed, or on the table on the table in the form of silverware. So getting the coinage, getting those ratios right. In fact, I sort of slipped in 16 to 1 with Hamilton. It wasn't quite 16 to 1, it was 15.5 to 1. It was 15.5 to 1 because that was the right ratio. It later became 16 to 1 in 1837. But you're on like a knife edge. And sometimes gold circulates and silver doesn't. And sometimes silver circulates and gold doesn't. And the dearer metal gets hoarded. So that was sort of, that's why I say there's some optionality. It's not that they both circulate at all times. It's that there's a flip over point when one gets more valuable and relative to the other. So bimetallism had some appeal, although everybody really wanted, everybody really wanted gold. Gold was just much more valuable, much more scarce. But it was so scarce that it wasn't useful in circulation. But in 1850, 1849, we had gold discovered in California. We had gold discovered in Australia. And that's what set the trigger for the world, actually, to say, well, now we can go on a gold standard, which is what we really wanted anyway. And in fact, there was a major conference of all countries in the world in 1867 that John Sherman of the Silver Purchase Act, of the senator, and the author of the crime of 1873, he spent the whole year in 1867. He was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Spent the whole year in Paris, and they They called him Monsieur le Sénateur, which made him very happy. And they decided that the world should go onto a gold standard. Now, Britain was already effectively on a gold standard, and it was the most successful country at the time. But so then France and Germany, Bismarck, wanted to be as powerful as England. How do you become powerful? Make gold the monetary standard. So both France and Germany in 1870 got off bimetallism and went to gold, which is why John Sherman, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, in 1873 sort of pushed this legislation which said, well, we dropped a sentence in the legislation that allowed miners to bring silver and get $1.29 for it. And that was the beginning of the decline in the price of silver, and why it is, in a sense, it is called the crime of 1873. And Sherman wanted the United States to go on the gold standard, like he saw in the conference in 1867, like he watched France and Germany do in 1870.
So So you just talked about how John Sherman was the architect of the crime of 1873, the Coinage Act of 1873. And you also write in your book about how he was rather deceitful in advancing that legislation by claiming that it does not adopt any new principles, even though in reality it had changed the American monetary system fairly profoundly. Now, many coin collectors are familiar with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, but fewer know about Sherman's legislative record, which you just laid out, his role in the crime of 1873. And the association with Sherman with the Silver Purchase Act belies his kind of complex relationship with silver and a bimetallic system. So what convinced Sherman to move away from bimetallism, and how does the 1890 Silver Purchase Act, how does that square with the crime of 1873 and his role in it?
That's a great question. So, but we've already talked about why Sherman did it. Sherman did it because he was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He was in Europe in 1867. He wanted to be great like the Europeans, like Britain, and he saw that Germany and France switched. So he forgot to put in that one sentence allowing the Treasury to pay $1.29 for an ounce of silver. He would have been fine if he had kept his mouth shut. If instead of saying, no, this thing doesn't do anything, and by the way, we all know the Coinage Act of 1873 primarily had to do with the mint. Okay, it brought the mint, which had been an independent agency, it brought it into the Treasury. And there were a whole bunch of specific dealings with how much do you pay the guy, and also the overwhelming part was the Coinage Act was about the mint. And Sherman just should have let it be, instead of saying during the discussion, instead of saying there's nothing very important about this, because dropping silver as a monetary metal was quite important, as the subsequent 20 to 30 years showed. Namely, it perpetrated a huge deflation because the gold that we thought was going to be so plentiful turned out to be not so plentiful. Okay? Well, so by 1890, a lot of people wanted to restore silver at $1.29. And Sherman really didn't want to do that. He said, that would be a grave mistake. So as a sop to the Silverites, which were all in the Midwest, as a sop, he said, all right, we're going to do the Silver Purchase Act. We're going to buy $2 million or $4 million worth of silver every single month. And Sherman says in his memoirs The day after the Silver Purchase Act of 1890 was passed, I was ready to repeal it. So, although it's called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and he, in fact, proposed the legislation, it was a diversion to prevent these silver rights, to prevent William Jennings Bryan, who came later, from reestablishing silver as at $1.29.
So let's talk about silver during this window, and I'll sort of bring it to the present or near present to start my construction of this question for you. So the United States Mint for a long time is they've produced dollar coins because Congress and some agitators feel that a dollar coin would be a cost savings to the American people and the government over a paper $1 bill. But at the same time, we don't eliminate the paper $1 bill, so the dollar coin will never circulate. Going back to 1878, we saw the reintroduction of the silver dollar. After 1873, the United States made a trade silver coin for mostly for Asian export, but we start to make the silver dollar again in 1878, and the Sherman Silver Act essentially just compelled the government to buy even more than they're already buying, and the sub-treasury vaults and the mint vaults and in Carson City, San Francisco, and New Orleans, and Philadelphia were filled with unwanted silver coins that nobody spent. They had so many of them, in fact, that they leaked out of the treasury throughout the 20th century until speculators emptied the vaults in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So
surrounding the Treasury building to get those coins. I remember, yes.
So being that this is the case at the time, that the sort of the marketplace of ideas, if you will, is already rejecting the circulation of these silver coins, and they're stuck in vaults. So I guess the government's using them to back a fiat or a currency at this point. Why would politicians still think it was a good idea to keep making more of these unwanted silver discs?
It's first of all, I mean, we all know. I mean, we have I've got a bunch of silver dollars. Okay, I'm not a collector, but they're heavy. They are just too heavy to carry around. Okay, the only place that really used them was out west. The cartwheels and in Las Vegas. We know this. Okay, but the silver miners didn't want to hear about that. The price of silver was too low for them. And the politicians said, all right, Nevada politicians were obsessed with it because they had a big constituency and they were powerful because 14 senators were from states that had a mining interest. So that's why we have silver coins, because there were a lot of miners who wanted maybe call it a backstop. Maybe it may have been a front stop. They wanted to be able to sell their silver at a higher price than the market would have paid them. And
sounds like socialism to me.
Oh, well, yeah, it could be socialism. It's good old American politics. I mean, we've had we've got lobbyists. That it was the silver lobby and the silver bloc that were needed to pass important legislation, and that's why we have the silver dollars that look so beautiful. They really are magnificent, but nobody wanted to carry them around. Again, give me a piece of paper. I'll keep the silver dollar in the coin. The lined coin box that I have.
So you write in You use the example of the silver subsidy and its impact on nationalist China as they were trying to, the government of Chiang Kai shek, as it was trying to fend off Japanese aggression. And you write about the dangers of domestic policymaking that don't take into account potential worldwide consequences. And you write that this lesson has resonance today in an era of America First politics. What specific issues do you see that are analogous today? What issues do you see today that are similar to America's silver policy in the
Oh
1930s?
boy. I would say nothing compares to that. And nothing compares to that. I should add a word, so far. And the point that I was trying to make was not that FDR shouldn't have done it. I mean, maybe the trade-off of getting the New Deal passed was worth it. And the connection that I make between high silver prices, the consequences for China, and Japan taking advantage of that, which, by the way, they did. There's no question about it. There's enough of Japanese statements and in the foreign embassies and so on to support that they understood quite well. They offered to protect China from America's perverse silver policy. And when China went off the silver standard, which they did in November of 1935, in fact, the Japanese War Office became much more powerful than its Foreign Office, because the Foreign Office no longer could help nationalist China stay on the silver standard because they were off the silver standard. So there's no question that this had an effect, but it's tenuous and it's not clear 100%, although I make the argument that but for this, Chiang Kai-shek would have remained in power. I can't say that, although this certainly contributed to his losing, and it certainly encouraged Japanese aggression.
Well, it's interesting to me though. Like if you think about the communist revolutions too. I mean, you go back, 20 years before that, when the Russia was having the same issue with the communist revolution. Communists come into power, and one of the first things they attack is the monetary system. And they essentially put like the average Russian back into like a level of poverty not seen in the country since the 17th century. And what do they do to fix it? They go onto the gold standard almost a year later. So they sort of recover in a little bit. So even I would say even in a communist system, they can't really avoid the international established monetary system.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that. And Lenin supposedly said, although Keynes really was quoting Lenin, and he may have made up the quote, about the way to attack capitalism is to debauch the currency. But the point that I was making was that domestic policy, which was the New Deal at the time, at least should have said, well, do we want to hurt indirectly China, and what should we do about it? And you could have still made the decision, nah, we got to do this. And I think the same lesson we have today. And what I mean by that is when Donald Trump said that he was in favor of tariffs, why was he in favor of tariffs? Well, because there was a narrow constituency in the washing machine industry, in the furnace industry, in all the industries that were protected by tariffs. And the employees form a very vocal support because they're concentrated. And yet Americans as a whole are hurt tremendously by tariffs. You don't think about it when you pay an extra 3 or 4 or 7 or 12 cents for a shirt, a baseball bat, or anything that gets imported, because the effect of that is diffuse. Okay? A couple of pennies here, a couple of pennies there, big deal, right? Enough of that, and it adds up. So, I think that focusing on just domestic concerns is a mistake. You've got to at least think about international repercussions. That's the lesson, I think, of the consequences of the Silver Purchase Act of 1934 on China. Namely, you've got to at least consider international consequences. That's not to say that they should dominate. You can make a decision that they don't, but you can't just say America first. I don't care about anything else.
Well, domestic economic conditions were central to the massive silver bubble that began sort of expanding in the 1970s and fueled largely by the Hunt brothers. And many collectors remember the massive silver bubble of 1979-1980 because it drove silver prices up to a record level, a record that's never been beaten, that hasn't been beaten since 1980. And also, a lot of coin collectors know about the Hunt brothers because of the sale of their coin collections in 1990. Could you summarize the Hunt brothers' legacy, explain why they were so fixated on silver? And could you also explain the argument that you make in the book that their 1988 price manipulation conviction was wrong?
So, you slipped in a bunch of things over there before you asked that final question. And I don't know whether I'm going to let you get away with it without an argument. That is, you said a bubble. That there was a bubble, that they contributed to a bubble. And, the only time something is a bubble is after it bursts. There's no other way that you can say this was a bubble until it collapses. And back then, it was very smart for people to distrust the value of the dollar, to worry about inflation, to buy protection. Today we call it portfolio insurance. It means what? Buy things which don't move lockstep with everything else. It just doesn't make sense. So what we know happened in the 1970s was increasing inflation. Inflation in the United States was in the double digits. And then in 1979, in January of 1979, both gold and silver took off like in a trajectory that had never been seen since, except it did almost repeat itself after 2008. What happened? January 1979, inflation gets out of control. We are very worried about it. Gold goes from $200 an ounce in January of 1979 to $800 an ounce in January of 1980. And there was more than inflation to worry about. There was the hostage taking in November of 1979 in Iran. There was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December. So there were lots of turmoil. And silver, instead of just quadrupling like gold, goes up almost 8 times. Goes from $7 in January 79 to $50. And everybody, including everybody who blames the Hunts, and by the way, I'm not related to them, so it's not because I have a soft spot in a family relationship. They're the furthest thing from my politics. But silver goes up twice as much. And that's one of the proofs used, and I'm getting to to try to answer your question about the proof in the 1988 allegation that they manipulated. One of the proofs is, well, silver went up twice as much. That's just primarily because the hunts were driving it up. Silver, we all know, the metal is twice as volatile as gold. On a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, it has always been twice as volatile. And in 2008, when there was no more hunt, and when there's no more after Lehman's bankruptcy, between Lehman's bankruptcy in 2008 and the European debt crisis, gold goes up 250% over a 3-year period, and silver goes up 400%.
Let me think about this. So, my understanding, I mean, the Hunts were Berkshires, right?
Oh, what?
At least Nelson Bunker Hunt was he was a Berkshire, wasn't he?
He was a member of the John Birch Society, correct?
Right. So, and of course, they make their fortune off of the Libyan oil fields, and a despot named Muammar Gaddafi sort of puts the kibosh on that at a certain time. So they obviously at a certain point go into a different direction with their silver crusade that they went on. When I think about 2008, a few things happen. Of course, we have obviously you mentioned the Great Recession, but we also have the election of Barack Obama. And I was active in this industry around this time, in the numismatic industry. And many of the pitches that were used by radio marketers or companies selling precious metals to people had a clear political fear-based message. Fear the government, fear the big spending of the Obama administration. And of course, the government's profligate spending has been an ongoing issue probably since the Reagan administration. However, you get to 2016 and 17, the profligate spending and the debt borrowing doesn't stop. There's no magic ideological remedy where one party gets into power and fixes it because the other party always had things wrong. The country essentially just continues to careen towards the iceberg, strike the iceberg, back the boat up, hit the iceberg again, and then blame the other guy. And that just seems to be like how we go about it. So, but the precious metals market did not behave during the Trump administration in much the same way it behaved during the first 2 years of the Obama administration, when silver and gold both reached peaks, but then sort of declined and had a decade or more or less of not very active trading. So why was there, on the one hand, this sort of conservative movement towards these metals, and then once they had their ultimate president and Trump, did they sort of walk away from this as a place to put their money?
Well, yeah, I'm going to say a couple of things that I think are not quite at variance, but it's a different perspective on what you say. It wasn't just conservatives who were worried in 2008 about government spending. I was worried. Many mainstream economists were worried. And it was not just Lehman, because in 2008, gold and silver went up by 20%. Okay? Not 400. It went up by 400% when Italy, Ireland, and Spain were on the verge of default, or at least perceived to be on the verge of default in 2011. So this did not occur during the spending on Great Recession. There was a little jump, okay? So the history shows that you had a big jump. My point of bringing up 2008 to 2011 was primarily to talk about the relative movements of gold and silver compared to 1979. You had the same thing. It was over a much longer period. But it was not just America spending like crazy. It was not just Obama, although I'll say it again. There was huge deficit spending. And then the fear goes away because we didn't have the inflation, and everybody was wrong, who called for inflation. So gold and silver decline, collapse. Okay, silver, gold. By the way, silver hit $48 an ounce, and you should be asking, well, if things were so much worse and so bad, why in 2011, when gold made a new high of $1,900 an ounce compared to $800 in 1979, silver didn't even hit. It got to 48. That's close enough. Why didn't silver go to $100? The answer, I think, is photography. Silver is not just a precious metal. Silver is an industrial metal. And if you compare 1979 and 2008, 9, 10, 11, the fundamentals of silver's industrial use were very different. There was no photographic industry. So silver is used in medicine and so on and so forth. So the fundamentals held silver down. So, and that's just as an aside. I mean, because an important question is, if the Huns didn't do anything, how come you got gold going up to 1900 and silver? I think the economic silver, I hate to bring it up, is like a switch hitter. Sometimes in baseball, sometimes it is viewed as a precious metal, but very often it is an industrial metal. And by the way, that was this, because I never told you that there was a second big surprise in addition to FDR, and that was Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett hates gold, and yet in 1997 he took a position in silver that was 3/4 of the Huns. He bought silver in 1997, 130 million ounces. The Huns bought 200 million. It's the same thing. And he drove up the price of silver. He viewed the imbalance between supply and demand. Silver had declined to $4 an ounce in 1997. And Buffett's willingness to speculate in silver was, in fact, based on fundamentals, okay? And his actions in silver really stunned me. Nobody. I mean, it's a forgotten chapter, unless you're a numismatist, maybe. But he bought silver in bulk, okay? So, but the point is the fundamentals for silver changed radically in 2011. And after that, the price of silver and gold collapsed. In 2019, I argued you need precious metals in a portfolio. That doesn't mean you should be putting half your net worth there. You should put 5% of your net worth in precious metals. And in 2019, I wrote an article for Market Watch. I don't know if you're allowed to say that in here, but Market Watch is one of these websites, financial websites. Silver was trading at $15 an ounce. Gold was trading at about $1,300 an ounce. And I said, put most of your precious metal portfolio insurance into silver, because it will move twice as much as gold when there are pressures on the credibility of the financial system. So if you look at it compared today, and by the way, we don't have a big problem now. You're absolutely right. The deficit is so much bigger and nobody cares. But silver went from 15 to 25, a 65% increase, and gold is now 1,300 to 1,750, which is about a 30% increase. So silver is just more volatile. It is more volatile to the upside, and more volatile to the downside.
So, what do you think goes into like our? Let's just talk about maybe human psychology for a minute. Let's get away from what the government wants us to do and just get back to like the way we think as communities. Um, the South Africans began to strike bullion coins. The Mexicans struck bullion coins. Canadians start striking bullion coins throughout the 60s and the 70s. The United States, with the Liberty Coin Act, begins to strike silver and gold bullion coins. And of course, there's the what would surprise people is that these were not necessarily envisioned as coins that would just be bought piecemeal, one or two at a time. The government doesn't really look at it that way. They make these monster boxes of 500 of these coins. Many are bought by institutional investors. Some are bought by just wealthy people, and then it trickles down to regular, everyday Americans who may have a roll or a handful of these silver or gold coins. What do you think it is about us that makes us want to buy these products? That sort of, what is the allure of this metal on us when we don't really tangibly have a relationship with these metals as money anymore? There's nobody buying a silver eagle and working in the economy today has a physical memory of spending an eagle. Or most people don't even remember a silver quarter or a Franklin half dollar. But when it comes to these silver eagles and these gold eagles, and now platinum and palladium eagles, there seems to be still an allure to these objects. What is it about these metals that is able to hold this this idea of value on us when we don't relate to them as money anymore?
That's a great question. And my answer is 5,000 years of history. So until about 50 years ago, till 1971, okay, when Nixon finally, I mean, we talk about Roosevelt in 1934, but gold still was a pillar of the monetary system until 1971. Foreign central banks could take pieces of paper and bring them into our dollar bills and bring them into the treasury and get gold at $35 an ounce until Nixon stopped. So I would say, when did we go off the gold standard? 1934, somewhere between 1934 and 1971. Okay? And the last nail, and we have been on a fiat standard. The world has been on a fiat standard over the last 50 years. 1971, 1921, right? Is that 50 years? I think. Okay. And yet, you go back before 1971 to Egypt. Egypt, by the way, was had primarily silver, and there's an argument that said that silver was more valuable in Egypt than gold. But in any case, we have 5,000 years of recorded history that identified precious metals as what we use for money. And it's just the last 50 years that we have severed the link between what we use as money and precious metals. I am not saying, we're going back to the gold standard, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is 50 years of fiat currency is like the blink of an eye in history. I mean, we're doing fine, really doing fine. And I would say the legacy of Paul Volcker is that he saved the U.S. system when it was about to disappear in 1980. Not just because I wrote a book about him, a biography, but when Volcker killed inflation, and Greenspan sort of built on that, we are enjoying that legacy. but it's a blink in the eye of history. And I think we still have this visceral attachment to a tangible, a tangible monetary system. I'm not saying we're going back to gold, but you asked why, and I say 5,000 versus 50 is the reason.
How has COVID-19 impacted the silver market? And if you were going to update your book to include a chapter on our current crisis that has driven silver prices up, what would you write? How would you describe it?
I'm going to say two things, 2 points. First, I can't write it yet. It's not over.
Sure.
We don't know what the. I mean, we're coming out of a major crisis with huge government spending, and we're relying on 10 years worth of history to say that that huge spending is not going to have any consequence, major consequence. And I don't know, I really don't know whether that's true or not. And therefore, silver belongs, as gold does, in a portfolio as insurance against, I don't know what it's insurance against. Okay? Everything. It's not just inflation, it's just the credibility of the system. It's the credibility of our monetary system. So it's not clear that I don't know if I can write anything yet definitively, except it is clearer than ever before that you must hold a small fraction, and what by small I mean 3 to 5% of your net worth, in precious metals. Why? The answer is because when nothing works, it will work. When nothing works, it will work.
Is the challenge posed by COVID to the stability of our, and maybe this is a ludicrously broad question, but is the challenge posed by COVID-19 to our monetary system unique? And did silver respond to the economic pressures of COVID about how you might have expected it to, or has it behaved a little bit differently, or is it too early to say?
When you say COVID, I mean, I didn't interpret your question as did the disease have an impact on silver? And if that's what you meant, you should tell me. I responded to the government's response to COVID
Mm,
and how that had an impact on silver.
sure.
And that's what I was answering. And I answer it the same way. By the way, on March 23rd, 2020, March 20th, 2020, silver sold for $11 an ounce. 11. It was trading around 15 in March a year before. In March of 2019, silver was trading at $15 an ounce. Gold was trading at $1,300 an ounce. That's when I say buy both, just as a portfolio insurance. But on March 20th, when the world was coming to an end because of COVID-19, they sold everything. They sold everything, not just stocks, but also precious metals. Now, that was it was just even minutes. You had to be there probably, it was minutes, and then it immediately shot up again. So, again, I don't think we know the answer yet of whether the current level of debt spending, the current huge increase in monetary assets, whether we will, in fact, get away with that and allow that to fully restore economic activity without producing inflation and mistrust of government, or whether we're in for some more surprises. It's just too early to tell.
Well, Bill, I have to say on behalf of Chris and myself, we appreciate you coming on. We both enjoyed your book, The Story of Silver, how the white metal shaped America and the modern world. One of the things I think I liked most about it is I didn't feel like I had to be a graduate student to understand what is typically presented in a very dense way. The story of silver and its relationship to gold essentially is the story of America and how we went from a colonial backwater to a global hegemon. Probably without the gold rush of 1848, I don't know if the Union Army or the federal government has the funds to prosecute the war against the Southern rebellious states, and without the rich metal surplus we had, I don't know if we bail England out when Sherman was waging economic war against it in India. So we have been very blessed and fortunate to either have or annex mineral-rich land in this country, and to have it at our disposal when we needed it the most. So we do appreciate you coming on and sharing with our audience your wealth of experience and knowledge about this topic.
All I can say is that you guys know quite a bit, and I was quite impressed with the questions that you asked and your ability to push me to remember what I had forgotten and to articulate things that normally most people don't push me on. So I thank you guys as well.
If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends. Remember, you can download every episode of the CoinWeek podcast for free on the iTunes Store, stream it online on our YouTube channel, or on coinweek.com. For CoinWeek, I'm editor Charles Morgan. Until next time, happy collecting.